us down to Dr. Allen. Our first question is for you.
Oh boy.
Gotta get that clean up.
All right, so as we saw in the film, both major Pennsylvania baseball teams were featured. Can you tell us more about their place in this story during that time period?
Well, I think some of the segments, which are really some of the most troublesome and probably get you out of your seat, the segments are about Ben Chapman and the Phillies, and that's an interesting subject. It's always interested me because I'm some kind of a backsliding Phillies fan. Been on the season. No, I've always been kind of a Phillies fan. But the more I learned about Negro League history, it was hard to say I'm a Phillies fan, so I still say it. But Chapman, of course, as you saw, the vitriol that came from Chapman is pretty accurate to what we know. Probably is worse than what was recorded in the film. And of course, then the question, why did the Carpenter family let him do this? And I mean, all the Negro League players I've interviewed, I've asked them what they thought of Philly, what was their read on why it was the way it was, and I think probably overall sentiment was that it was a job thing. There was certainly cultural racial hostilities from the Southerners, but as you saw, some of those Southerners came around. But they were fearful of losing jobs, and then rightfully so, because these white players, no matter who they were, as racist Southern or Northern Southern, they knew what was in the Negro Leagues. They knew there was talent there, and they knew they might lose jobs. When it comes to other factors, some of the players have pointed out that Philly sort of is still a Southern town in some ways, and there's that kind of a sensibility. But then we have the likes of Judy Johnson, who scouted for the Phillies, and we have people that spoke well of the Carpenter family. So the real problem to me always was, why didn't the Carpenters put a clamp on Chapman's mouth right away, sooner and so forth? So that's one aspect. I think competition for jobs, not only among baseball players, but in the larger population, with a large segment of people in the Great Migration coming up to Philly and working the shipyards, and a lot of the players from the Philadelphia Stars worked in the Sun shipyards, built ships for World War II, but were much discriminated against, pipe fitters and all kinds of jobs. We looked at Pittsburgh, and I'll back into Pittsburgh. The situation was probably a little different, maybe ethnically a little more diverse, and the black population was traditionally, I don't want to say necessarily accepted, there was certainly racism in Pittsburgh, but Bensfanger, who was in charge kind of at that period, seemed to be much more open. He certainly tried to have tryouts for Negro League players, and they didn't seem to be shams, according to my read, and you guys can comment, but he held some tryouts. Jackie was among them, Campanella, I think, in one, and there was an attempt there. Of course, the storied history of the Homestead Grays and the Crawfords out of Pittsburgh lent the fact that in that area, in little towns like, I know Vandergrift, a place where a dear friend of mine, Miss Thelma Price from Penn State here, just passed away. She used to tell me stories about Vandergrift, how the towns, little towns like that, they'd come out, they'd want to see the Homestead Grays when they were playing in the literally like backyards. So there was probably a different sentiment there. And when you compare, we have this rivalry, Philadelphia-Pittsburgh. Why was Philadelphia appearing so racist? So I think there's a lot of factors, particularly beyond baseball. People were scared. I mean, these wonderful, some of them wonderful, technically baseball people, managers, didn't necessarily have any backbone against Jim Crow. And as Larry Doby's brother-in-law once said to me, he said, "That's just the way it was." He says that in the famous movie by Bud Greenspan. He's quoted it, and "That's just the way it was." I can hear Ben say that. And it's not a justification, but that is the way it was, that racism, unfortunately, baseball up to the point of Rickey and others who made the attempts. Of course, it's interesting, as much as you hear the slights on Pittsburgh at the time in the film, Rickey ends up in Pittsburgh, and then when he manages Pittsburgh, who's he bring in? Roberto Clemente. And so bringing Clemente in as the first noticeably man of color who's a Latino, Rickey doesn't give up, even on Pittsburgh. So it is an interesting comparison, but I think it's complex. I'm not sure I can give you one easy answer on that one.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Dyerson, our next question is for you. In the film, we see Wendell Smith, a sports writer for the Black Pittsburgh Courier, serve as Jackie's liaison with Branch Rickey and the black community. Can you tell us a little bit about what the segregation of the newspapers looked like during that era?
Every major city in the United States and a lot of smaller ones had a black as well as a white newspaper. Large cities like New York and Philadelphia had multiple African American newspapers. The Pittsburgh Courier is one of the most well-known ones in the United States, and it's got national as well as a local edition that comes out once a week. With the Chicago Defender, it's probably one of the two major ones. And one of, I'm a historian, I hate to nitpick because I love the movies, but one of the licenses taken here, the relationship between Wendell Smith and Jackie Robinson is not quite as portrayed. Jackie Robinson knew who Wendell Smith was. Everybody knew who Wendell Smith was. Everybody knew who the Pittsburgh Courier was. They had been and the black press had been advocating for the integration of baseball for 2 decades before Robinson ever showed up. Wendell Smith ought to be in the Hall of Fame for what he did, as well as Jackie Robinson. So it's a fascinating story, and the black press is really, it doesn't come through the film, but the black press is one of the true heroes of the reintegration of baseball. On Philadelphia, just to throw it in, throw in a few more comments on why Philadelphia was so reluctant. I think it's the organization. The Phillies are one of the last 4 clubs to integrate. Long after Chapman's gone, they're still not bringing black players up. The Red Sox are the last team to integrate, not until 2 years after Jackie Robinson retires. It's 1959 when the Red Sox finally get a black player. The Phillies get one in 57, the year he retires. So it had a lot to do. That organization was notoriously anti-black for a variety of reasons. The city itself, it's harder to say. One of the other Final 4 to integrate are the Yankees in New York, where this is happening for a variety of historical reasons. So it varies from club to club and city, and the dynamics are complex. And Pittsburgh is an interesting case on the other side, with a strong tradition of black teams in all kinds of sports. Cumberland Posey in basketball and baseball, and so.
What are some of the variety of reasons? You said variety of reasons. What are some?
A variety of reasons in each city.
You said Philadelphia, then you said the Red Sox. Instead of variety of reasons for Philadelphia, then you said the Red Sox. What are some of them?
Oh, in Philadelphia, I think it's the ownership of the club in particular. It's a racist
Boston's a good
ownership,
example.
and even more so the Red Sox, especially the Red Sox. So Philadelphia had a large historic African American population, but the Phillies did well at the gate. Remember too why the Dodgers integrated, why it was the Dodgers and Branch Rickey, and some of it's humanitarian. And Branch Rickey's an interesting guy. But the Dodgers are the 3rd team in that market. They're a struggling franchise. We have this myth of the Brooklyn Dodgers as this beloved team that everybody went to their games. That's inaccurate. They went to LA for a reason. They were struggling. And so it was easier to experiment than with the Yankees and the Giants in New York, who had huge followings, and it was a real risk. Rickey's brought into the Dodgers to kind of revitalize them, but they are not a model major league franchise. They are struggling. So he could take a risk there. And that's what he's doing. He's looking to draw more fans. He recognizes New York has a large African American population. A lot of it's economic. If he can draw, and there's pressure in New York to integrate politically and socially as well. But if he can be first, and if he can beat the Giants and the Yankees, he might well, raise the market status of the Dodgers. And it worked partially. It raised the market status of the Dodgers all over the U.S. They were the team African Americans followed, and the Indians in the American League. He built a generation of African American fans, but it didn't really work in the long run within New York, and so they were going to move to L.A. the year basically after Robinson retires.
All right, Dr. Ukelson. Branch Rickey had a fairly precise idea of the type of player he wanted to draft and integrate the Dodgers with. Can you share with us the type of character and personality Jackie needed to have to be resilient during such a difficult time? And how do you think Branch Rickey was able to identify such a specific type of player, and what does that say about him as a person?
Well, I don't have the whole historical background that you gentlemen have. I'm only going on the movie itself, but you can tell Branch Rickey in the movie had to find the right person who would be able to have the resiliency, the mental toughness, to be able to handle the catcalls, the racist comments, and and as he went through the whole scouting system, there was a person that he picked out right there that thought he'd be able to handle the character. And I think it also the support system that he had as well was very important for him to stay strong. As an innovator, perhaps it was capitalism, perhaps it was money. Later on in the movie, they talked about when he was a coach at Ohio Wesleyan, I think it was, he felt like he didn't really do enough, and that was his motivation and his passion to try and make a difference. So I thought it was an interesting link right there from the socio-cultural aspect. One other aspect too that I thought was great in the movie was just the development of the culture of baseball in the locker room and the infighting and trying to fit in, and you know, it was just interesting when they went from town to town, and highlighting then in Philadelphia that they weren't able to get the hotel there, and you know, how dare you do this to us, and how it bonded the team together eventually. So I think he was an innovator, and I think at the end it also said that Roy Campanella was the next person and Don Newcomb. So I have to give as a fan as opposed to a sports psychologist, because I grew up in Los Angeles, and I'm glad they moved out to Los Angeles. The things that they were able to do there too, and breaking the barrier. One other thing I'll just add there with the Dodgers, then when they moved out to Los Angeles, Fernando Mania, and the culture there for Latinos to be able to come, and the Mexican population, and it was really a great thing that the Dodgers were able to do there.
Right, Blake. Do you feel this film is important to the world of baseball today?
I definitely think it's important to the world of baseball today. Dealing with potential student athletes, we bring in recruits all the time, and our right field wall, our field here, Medler Field at LeBron Park, it's modeled after PNC Park in Pittsburgh. Well, the PNC Park in Pittsburgh is 21 feet high, the right field wall is. Well, it's 18.55 feet high for the year Penn State was founded here, but 21 feet high for Roberto Clemente. So we brought a young man in, and I was telling him this, and he said, "Who?" And I looked at him, I said, "No, you have to know who Roberto Clemente is." And he had no idea. And it's just that generation below me. I'm young, I understand that, but I'm a baseball guy through and through, and so I know the history of the game. I think it's important that we keep teaching the kids that are growing, who are between 5 and 10 now, that black players weren't always allowed to play in baseball. I mean, if they hear the story, they'll be like, where are the night games? I mean, if you watch the movie, I think one of the cool things that a lot of people might not realize is just listening to the radio announcer, the detail he had to put into the games, because there was no television. He had to tell them it's hot out here, or he would make different metaphors. And I think kids just don't understand that the game was completely different back then, but it was still baseball. I think just teaching them the history of the game is important. Players, there may be high school kids who don't know who Jackie Robinson is, and it's a shame. I think it's important movies like this are shown and played, that way they can understand and appreciate the game and where it's come.
All right, Dr. Ugelson, other questions here?
Okay.
As incredible as Jackie Robinson's story is, we know that such struggles can kind of pay a toll on a person. His health was extremely poor when he had retired in 1956, coping with hypertension, diabetes, and later passing from a heart attack in 1972 at the age of 53. What does this kind of stress, both emotional and physical through sport, put on an athlete's body? And what do athletes do today to kind of manage that kind of stress?
Well, there's two aspects of that question. The first one's very hard to answer, to pinpoint and say hypertension or diabetes is the reason it was caused by baseball. It could be a familiar thing, a family thing, it could be genetics. So I'm not sure I would actually link that as, you know, the stress response. But the stress of going through being the first African American baseball player, and just the way it takes a toll mentally and emotionally was difficult for him. But again, path setter as opposed to maybe a stressor. Here in stress in our student athletes, you know, there's different ways for them to manage, and I think nutrition is actually one of them. You've seen the game of baseball change a lot. Even in the clubhouse here, they have people drinking beers, and you know, now there's more attention paid to the nutritional component of recovery. I think the stress aspect, at least our student athletes, they have so many other demands in terms of academics and the travel, and they need to learn how to organize their time and still make time for themselves. I also think that most of our athletes, it's an outlet. And I heard today in a senior seminar, athletes talking about the outlet that sport has provided them as seniors, and it's their way to be able to escape. So not all stress is really bad. In fact, that positive stress is the energy that helps fuel them oftentimes to be able to channel it into peak performance. But if it's not managed properly, then you get into that distress level.
Can I ask a question?
So I kind of want to go back to the question about how Ricky would have identified him, and maybe from your perspective, because I guess, they had the stats and everything, but how would Ricky have been aware of Jackie Robinson's character? What, how would he have known those things? So I guess it's more like, how was the whole system set up? We saw people going around scouting and things like that. How would they have been aware?
Well, I think one thing, just in the scouting system, that's one aspect of it. You had numbers, you had performance data, but there was some referrals there to being a hothead or not a hothead and how they respond. So the scouting system was pretty intricate at that time as well.
I think one of the myths we have that's inaccurate is that black and white baseball players never competed against one another until Jackie Robinson came along. And there is a whole shadow, it's not really a shadow league, there's a whole set of postseason competitions between black and white baseball teams. Some in the United States in smaller towns like Altoona and Harrisburg, some in Latin America, in Panama, in Cuba, in places like that, in Canada as well. And so white baseball is aware of good Negro League players. There is direct head-to-head competition between these players. Jackie Robinson was not the best African-American baseball player in the United States in 1947, 46, 47, when Ricky is looking for someone to lead this great experiment. What Ricky's looking for is someone acceptable to the white community. College educated, Robinson went to UCLA. Used to dealing with whites in an integrated setting. Robinson grows up, he's born in Cairo, Georgia, but he moves when he's 6 months old and grows up in Pasadena, California, goes to integrated schools, is used to dealing with whites. He's a war vet, he's well-spoken. The specter hanging over all of it, by the way, is the hatred of Jack Johnson and Jack Johnson's interaction with white women. So Robinson's married to an African-American woman. He's considered safe. A lot of Negro League players, as Bob probably knows, having interviewed them, a lot of them grew up in the South. They're Southerners. They did not have opportunities for education. They are hard-living, hard-drinking guys, Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, and folks like that, colorful characters, but that's not who Ricky wanted, and that's not who white baseball and white America wanted in 1947. So it's got to be more than talent on the field. Now that said, Robinson was an amazing athlete. Baseball is probably his fourth or fifth best sport. I mean, this guy was All-American football player at UCLA. He led the then Pac-8 in scoring in basketball. He swam. He was a national champ in the long jump and track and field. He was a tremendous athlete, but he wasn't the best African-American baseball player around.
Yeah, I agree that whole context is really important. The Winter League, all the games in the Dominican Republic and Cuba and all the areas, there was scouting going on just by seeing these guys play. Although Ricky's plan was very intricate when you compare it to like what happened in Cleveland with Dobie going to Cleveland. Ricky had a long-term strategy, as he usually did. He had invented the farm system to a degree to simplify things, and so his scouting abilities were deep. One of the stories is, for example, that he was keeping his eye on Rachel. He wanted to know what Rachel Robinson was like. And of course, he was vetting, like we say today. He was vetting the whole family. Are there any bones in the closet? Was he going to be like DeRocher and end up being a disgrace? And one report, I don't know, it was Clyde Superforth or one of the guys came back from, I think seeing Rachel interact in Montreal, the report was, hey, if Jackie's good enough for Rachel Robinson, he's good enough for the Dodgers. That type of thing. But again, as was said, the Negro League confrontations gave a sense, and he just was looking at that. Probably he had so many players to choose from. Age was a consideration, certainly. Some of the older generation, the Negro League players, he thought were too old. Then there's somebody like Gibson, who was probably the one guy out of the Negro Leagues the most disappointed not be taken, and that's another whole story. But generally the talent was there, and it was a question of, like Mark said, this combination, this interesting combination of things he had to see, and Jackie had that. Although, as with Doby, they had strong personalities. We got a sense of that in the film. Doby was the same way. Our own Wally Triplett from Penn State told me stories of pulling Doby off of pushing him like onto a car down in Philly where some racist had yelled at him in the parking lot. And Larry was known to be kind of soft. And they weren't, these were tough guys, but one way or the other, they had different personalities, but they had to be psyched to be not psyched over all the racism they were facing. If not, the whole experiment might have gone down the drain. So.
Hang on to that mic, Dr. Brown. All right.
Jackie Robinson, he was a running back, halfback.
Yeah. I don't remember all his yardage and everything.
Yeah.
Fantastic stats. And they used to say that they would schedule a game and a track meet and as much as they could in the same day, same time frame, so he could
do both.
He could do both sports within an hour period or whatever it was, and that's just. When we forget that though, again, that was kind of normal. Doby's another example. They were 4-letter guys in high school. And then they went on and whatever.
Right, some had noted that when baseball began integrating black and white players, interest in the Negro Leagues declined. How did baseball players in the Negro Leagues at that time respond to Jackie Robinson being drafted?
Well, I would say from my experience of all these different players and all across the spectrum, they were very gratified to know Jackie went in. Now there was a little oddity there when he first went in. Why him? Who is this guy? I mean, there was literally players that they really didn't know. He had a half a cup of coffee with the Monarchs. He was there. He didn't complete a season, so he wasn't known in the Negro Leagues by some. He did have a reputation probably with some of them for football and other things, but this is the bittersweet of that period because it was clear, as was said, when people became Brooklyn Dodger fans because Jackie was there, when they became Cleveland fans because Larry Doby was there, they stopped going to some of the games. If it was a matter of cash or getting down the road, they put their money away to go to a game and so forth. And the Negro Leagues, of course, were being cherry-picked. The likes of Doby and Monty Irvin and all the other players that we think of, some of them are Hall of Famers, most of them are pretty well stolen by what had become the major leagues finally, again, the Caucasian leagues, stealing them from the Negro Leagues. And some owners like F.A. Manley in Newark, she protested. They fought back. There wasn't much they could do, and they did it reluctantly anyway because they knew they wanted these guys to go into the big league. That was the dream of Rube Foster, who founded the Negro League. So it was hard to see this integration happen, but in other ways that was their goal. So they had to give up this wonderful, I think, experience of the black community, which was Negro League baseball, which had its struggling times, like all baseball did in the beginning, but it took a bite. So here in the East, for example, Newark goes out of business. The Philadelphia Stars go out of business. The Baltimore Elites, all the teams by around 50 are pretty much gone. There's some remnants or some attempts, like in Philly. There's even a Philadelphia Stars in 1960, but it's not the Stars of the period. So it's bittersweet. But the players themselves, they express, "Wow, he's done this." And then Doby goes in, and then later you got Luke Easter and so forth, and they saw that. Personally, for some of them, it was tough because it was clear they weren't going to make the cut. One of my old friends who's passed down in Harrisburg, he had a tryout with the Dodgers in '52, and he was third in the cut out of 300, and he didn't make it. But he came back to Harrisburg and said, "Well, it wasn't my time." But again, they had to accept that just as much as they had to think about another question: what would they have done on the field? I've asked them, and a lot of them said, "I couldn't have done it." And so they respected Jackie for that. They said, "I'd have eaten up a Ben Chapman, I'd have whatever," which to me is a normal, pretty healthy response. So.
That portrayal, I talked to my uncles, I talked to my father, I talked to my grandfathers, and they talked about the portrayal of what it really was like from a black perspective, what actually happened when Jackie went to the major leagues in 1947. Talked to Lenny Moore, former person here, the experiences he had. That's very light, what we're seeing here. It's very, as a matter of fact, it's entertaining, but it was pretty ugly out there.
Oh, yeah.
And there were also what they call the crow's nest, where blacks stayed in the stadium. They were segregated. The things were happening to turnstile, the things were happening in the parking lot. What's that portrayal? Is this more entertainment or is this more informative?
I mean, I think Hollywood made this movie so kids this age
would
could
sell.
see it, and I'm glad they did. If this were a literal recreation of history, it would have an R or an NC-17 rating. It was beyond
Yes.
imagination. This is toned down.
I get it. I
what-
have to question for the audience, because my grandfather and my uncles talked about it. You couldn't have this conversation.
Yeah.
We just
Yeah.
even put a perspective, 47 to 64, and Martin Luther King, and just our whole society and how they adjusted. You know, that's 15 years in front of that. So it's a very difficult thing, the trail that all the African Americans had to be able to take.
The one thing you see in the film, maybe that keys into that, is that stack of manila folders with all
Yeah.
that hate mail.
Yeah.
But that wasn't just mail. I mean, I always emphasize in the period of Negro Leagues from 1887 up to 47, and really it goes beyond. It stays in the in the minor leagues, in the Sally League in the South. There's even evidence in 52, 55 through there, after the Brown versus Board of Education, that some of the southern states tighten up the law, and then we get the aggression. But the way I always frame it for the Negro Leagues is that's exactly the period in baseball. Well, the official Negro Leagues is actually a bit late. It's earlier than that, but
Yes.
it always corresponds with lynching in the United States. So the other film to see in this is one yet to be seen, and it's going to be X-rated or whatever the rating will be, because it's brutal. It's the lynching in 1911 of in Coatesville,
Yes.
just down the road here a
Right
little bit.
here.
It's all the areas. So it means that you go up and pitch, you do well, you don't do well, you might get lynched. And I have stories from guys taken down the road because they were pitching a good game. And in some cases, these racist language here, these racist characters are rooting for the local black team because the intruders, the other black team, the other Negro League team has come in, and they're pitching a good game. So there's that mixture of, like a rivalry, like some of us saw in high school. We have a tension between two high schools, but this is on racial lines, but it's so bizarre. But the reality for these people is when they get on the bus, they don't know what's going to happen at night going through these towns and cities. And
It's just fascinating how you
it's
mentioned-
animated in the film, I would say.
I like this because you're right on point, because Lenny, in my conversation, when Lenny was here at Penn State, this wasn't a very nice place to be.
Sure, Bloxon and Tripp would tell you that. Sure,
And
absolutely.
I just, he spoke of these things and how he, when they traveled. But this ushered all in, for Lenny coming here, all this stuff ushered in. We had, he came in 55, and right out of Reading, Pennsylvania, which was
Sure.
another place which was very interesting. But I like your portrayal.
But we always sugarcoat that. I mean, I'll say it right here. We sugarcoat what happened here at Penn State when there were threats by the Klan to the students, to the head of the Black Caucus and so forth. And I was with those students those years. And people said, no, it's not. We had the Klan organized in this town in 1979. They were organizing a basketball team in the high school. And I could go into that, but that, it's not that far distant.
Don't worry, I'll be in the office next week.
I don't have an office.
It's important to remember it doesn't end with Jackie Robinson. So I've got a Trivial Pursuit question for you. Who's the last major league player to start his career as an 18-year-old outfielder for the Indianapolis Clowns, a Negro League team, and a barnstorming team? Think of the name of the team, Clowns, like the Globetrotters. They did a lot of entertainment as well as playing baseball. And he's the last one to make the leap from the Negro Leagues to the major leagues. Does anyone know? Started out as an 18-year-old outfielder with the Indianapolis Clowns. He's a well-known name in baseball.
What did
No,
Aaron?
it's earlier than Jackson. Think all-time home run leader at one point in time. Hank Aaron.
Yeah, and then he went to Eau Claire.
Hank Aaron. So,
What year we talking where? What year
What's
you-
that?
What year you at?
Well, he's with the Clowns.
He's in the early 50s with
52
the
with the Clowns.
Indianapolis Clowns. He's the last one, the last major leaguer to make that leap. That started his career before the the
Yeah.
Negro Leagues dissolve. Look at the letters he gets in
That's phenomenal.
when he's chasing the home run record. They're not any different from the letters Robinson
His daughter's in
got.
college during that period, and Hank's daughter has to have an FBI agent
Yes.
in class, every class. She
And
has
this
to-
is the early 1970s. And, you know, this is 30 years later, and you still have enormous vitriol. And other things have changed too. I don't want to act like nothing changed, but
Yeah, but with
that
bonds later, I
animus-
would argue.
Yeah.
I just, and I don't want to steal, it's just the same thing was, I was here as a high school sophomore in 1967, and Joe Pittman was here. And that was a fascinating what kind of athlete he was. But to come here and actually be the only black person, or a few, and there were many persons who were at Penn State who passed. They were black, but they came in as white. But
One thing with your question, though, I think, I don't look at this film, as has been said here, I don't look at it as being like a sugar-coated thing. There are some historical problems in it, so we always want to be in this type of a Hollywood film of any kind of history, whether it's baseball or not. But one thing it does is emphasize the mythical part of baseball that's appealed to the best in us. And you see that with the draped arm around Jackie. You see that in all these little subtle things.
Yes.
And you see that by playing a game, it's possible to have an impact. Like with John Carlos, Tommy Smith. There's some guys, a bunch of other guys running around in circles. But what did they do to impact politics and everything? Some would argue. Stanley Glenn in Philadelphia, catcher for Philadelphia Stars, always argued. He would say, Bob, he would tell the audience, it's the Negro Leagues players, what we did, we realized in retrospect, we did more than the Supreme Court decision in a lot of ways.
Correct.
Because you open up hearts.
And
And-
athletics was a vehicle to
A
be able
vehicle,
to express
absolutely.
that.
Yeah. And this whole question we have in sociology, does sport mirror society and vice versa? We come to, well, yeah, it does, and that can get it in a rut. But boy, when it takes off, there's an impact there. And I think the integration, way before the civil rights movement formally, the impact of a Jack Johnson, and then Joe Louis has got to respond, and that's an interesting dynamic. But as was said, that's all in the context of this. And like those little kids, some of them want to be baseball players, they got something else in their head, and it may be a little, it's almost sappy sometimes, but the sappy stuff drives us more than just the hard rational arguments. We need both, I think. You know?
And it may have been a Hollywood movie, but still, the first
Yeah.
45 minutes of the film, I think in its own way, did touch on a lot of those things. The
Mhm.
problems, the socio-cultural things that are going on inside baseball and inside the locker room. I did think they did a good job of that.
I think they did, and the whole thing is just to relate to today, for us, feed forward. What's going on right now with for the black president, what's going on for Jackie Robinson, and also what was going on with Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, it wasn't a game; it was a religion, and this is a whole different perspective. Like you mentioned, Philadelphia is predominantly a southern town. That was that great migration coming to Philadelphia, and then the other one comes from Mississippi into Chicago. Big migrations. So it was,
We can almost look at the pop culture and the debate that's going on this week about the N-word.
Okay.
And can you get rid of the N-word, or is it a culture and how it's used in different contexts? And again, it's just open for debate.
in the black community, there are 9 different definitions for nigger.
I would like to raise a question about, you had mentioned there were historical inaccuracies in it. Of anything significant, did you see anything significant that was historically inaccurate?
Leo Droscher really got booted not for consorting with a Hollywood starlet, but for gambling. I mean, that's not significant.
What was the character? The charge
Yeah.
was something like corrupt.
But it was
Yeah,
his
but
character.
he was
It was
hooked
his
up with it.
character.
Yeah.
But he was known to be sleeping with the actor, so
Yeah.
that didn't help.
No, that didn't help.
I think it's more composite stuff. I mean, you mentioned a couple of things, I'm trying to think,
Well, I think
which they do in these kind of films.
you can only do so much in a film, but you have to leave a lot of stuff out. So remember, there's another African American in Daytona Beach with Jackie Robinson, who's his roommate, Roy Partlow, who's there just to be his roommate. The Dodgers are never going to keep him.
And Parlo's a good player.
Yeah, and so they leave that out. I don't know about, I'm not sure about the story in Philadelphia with the hotel. I don't know whether that's accurate or not. But Robinson, I mean, internally in the Dodgers, and this irritated Robinson forever, he's never allowed to room with a white player. And for his whole career, he fights this. And when the Dodgers go to St. Louis, they stay in segregated hotels. He and later Campanella and Newcomb have to go to a different hotel than the rest of the team till he retires in '57. And he was all over Ricky for that. And, you know, Ricky, those sorts of nuances probably don't make for a good historical Hollywood
Yeah, but
film.
you're talking about things that were left out rather
Yeah.
than things that
Or
were
emerged,
inaccurate. I think
Yeah.
it was very accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Wendell Smith is an example of what I had in mind. But Wendell
Yeah.
Smith he's a wonderful vehicle to make the movie go from
Yeah, well,
beginning
he
to end.
wouldn't
But
have done all that
well,
stuff.
Wendell Smith was important. Wendell Smith sits up on the roof of a dugout in a little chair because he can't be in the press box. And some of the press come up and sit with him, and they joke with him and say, "We came up. Well, what are you doing up here?" "Oh, we came up to get a tan." Some of the white guys say. Well, there was that kind of level. But Sam Lacey, for example, or Gene
Joe
Benson
Boss.
from the Philadelphia Stars is not mentioned. People like that, like Partlow, that they were influences, but they can't put that all in the movie. There's just all that detail. And people who don't know the history, this is not exactly the vehicle to teach that, maybe teach those details. So I see more, if there's a problem, it's by not omission, but like composite, which we always get.
I have a question for our assistant baseball coach. Do you know the history of baseball at Penn State and the African Americans' participation in it, and why for a period of 30 years there was not one black when we had some fairly good backs and stars in the football team and zero blacks?
I've been here since August, so I'm learning the history as I go.
Called pressure.
But the question is, why isn't there a
No,
black
no,
person?
I wondered if you knew.
If I knew? No, I am learning. I'm trying to learn from as many alum as just the general history of Penn State
Yeah,
baseball.
well, we had racism here
It's been everywhere.
among the coaching staff.
And that doesn't surprise me, but I think today we don't have a black player on our team. And when we all took the job, it was one thing we noticed. Just it's something you notice, and that's not a racist slight at the previous coaching staff or anything. Baseball, black baseball especially, it's dying. I think it used to be in the 70s, probably about 20% of the Major League Baseball players were African American. I think it's down to 7% now. Don't
Yep.
quote me, it's 7.5%, 8%. And there's a variety of reasons, and I'm very passionate about that subject, actually. I think the biggest problem is, and there are not as many black players today, is the scholarships from the NCAA. Football, for those who don't know, has 85 full scholarships to give out. Basketball has 11 full scholarships to give out. And football has about 100 guys. Basketball has about 10 guys. Baseball has 35 guys and 11 scholarships to give out. So we don't have anybody on our team who has a full scholarship to play baseball. So if I'm an athletic individual who may be from an inner city, say I'm a young black man who's talented at both baseball, basketball, and football, I'm going to go play football at the next level in college because I can get a full scholarship for it. You just can't do that in baseball. There's just not enough money in it. And so you're killing the game. And one way I would resolve that, if I'm Major League Baseball and I see the statistics of minorities are going down, I would help out the NCAA and say, hey, here's 5 more scholarships. Let's see what we can do to revive baseball in the inner city. It's also an expensive game, which doesn't help. I know one way to play college baseball is we scout summer teams because we can't see high school baseball. An above average summer team will cost about $2,000 to play for, which isn't feasible for everybody. We miss out on great young African American players who just play high school baseball and then play football because they're good athletes, and they go play football in college. I mean, you look at Jameis Winston, who's playing both sports. He's on a football scholarship. Does anybody know the reason he did not go to Alabama to play football?
Wouldn't let him play baseball.
Couldn't play baseball. And so there are great baseball players in the African American community. A vast majority of them, unfortunately, are choosing football and basketball and other sports. And I think one way to combat that is just raise scholarships for baseball.
But isn't baseball in decline in general, not just in minority communities and things like that? I mean, is the sport in trouble in general?
I don't think it is. I think if you look at this is based off revenue. Major League Baseball had the most revenue last year of all time. They had the most ticket sales of all time, and you have more people watching. You have a broader network, but I think it's becoming a popular game again. You have young stars like Trout and Harper who are gaining interest at a young level from a young age. You have Puig. You have all these young stars, and I think it's finally getting away from the steroid era or anything that we lost fans from, and it's finally becoming a game people are interested in again.
I'd just like to go back, if I can, for one thing what Blake said. There are programs out there. My son is actually involved in New York with the Harlem MVP, and they're going to the inner city to be able to try and rekindle baseball and teaching the skills and teaching life skills and dealing with kind of like the high visibility sports that are drafting away these kids. So, and I think by seeing Winston and Russell Wilson's on one of the late night shows tonight, and he keeps talking about the value of baseball that's helped him in football. And, you know, coming back to the purity of the game. You know, I could go one other place, but that's not really here in terms of why baseball maybe lost some of the popularity and what the commissioner did to turn his head when Bonds and McGuire and nothing was ever done to those guys when they're bringing in lots of money, and that was the avenue the commissioner thought was the right way to bring back baseball to the fans. You know, now you got the Dodgers and the Yankees and Angels spending multi-million dollars on athletes, and the fans are paying $500 to go see a game for $4. So it's ridiculous.
I mean, let me be the dissenter here, and I hate to, with our assistant baseball coach, say things that might trouble him. But baseball has been, and I love baseball, in relative decline in terms of market share and attention. It's been in relative decline for at least half a century and maybe 75 years. When Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, baseball was truly our national pastime. The NFL couldn't hold a candle to it. The NBA couldn't hold a candle to it. So if you look in long historical time periods, in the last 50 to 75 years, by any measurement, not that baseball's not doing well, you know, increasing revenues, and it has been, in terms of total market share and total attention in the U.S., it has lost ground to football and basketball. I don't know if that's good or bad, but you know, that's what's happened in some ways historically. It is trying to rebuild now. There are these programs, as Dave said, you know, Major League Baseball has tried to resuscitate Little League programs in inner city communities. You know, there is some recognition of this. Remember too, the percentage of African American baseball players has declined from, at some point in the 80s it was about 27%. It's down to 8.8% now, which is about, you know, the African American population of the U.S., but it's a historic decline in some way. So Major League Baseball is trying to do some things. But I think there's some critiques of Major League Baseball too that are probably fair, that some scholars have made. Major League Baseball has discovered an alternative labor market for people of color. It's in Latin America, particularly, and those players are cheaper, and they're more controllable to some extent than American players. And so it's just not one factor. But Major League Baseball, I think, knows it's got a different labor force, and it doesn't look to the African American community as much as it used to. That's a part of the issue. But it's trying to struggle with that now.
And that's a big component, though, because when you go full circle, you realize Ricky, in spite of his humanitarian sense, or whatever you want to call it, he said his color was green, and by tapping into the Negro Leagues, he was getting them virtually for free. So today in the Dominican, for example, Dominican Republic, the players are just dying to play baseball. There's a lot of factors for that, and they're wonderful players. We have even particular towns in the Dominican where you get pitchers and so forth, starting with Marichal. But it's a cheap population, and it's manageable. They're captive, so this is partly a labor question, and that means that then more Latino players are visible to a degree than were as the guys came in from the Negro Leagues. They were more visible. They catch attention. They emulate. They're emulated by the young kids, and you get that whole kind of cycle. So, but part of it is certainly the money, which is unfortunate. the RBI programs that Major Leagues have, which they mean by that restoring baseball in the inner city, they started with an academy in California. The next one is slated to be Philadelphia, and the coach Steve Bandura has been waiting for this academy for Major Leagues to get off their butts, quite frankly, and it's all there, the workings, but there was a lot of talk in the last 10 years, and it still hasn't happened. So that I would add to the critique of the top levels of the franchises, where they talk a game and then they don't always deliver. They do a lot for they did that with the Negro League players, by the way. They celebrated them, gave them a little cash, and it was well received and welcomed. But at the end of the day, they weren't changing what they've been doing for decades. So.
And I'll touch real quick about the overall popularity of baseball. I think, to quote James Earl Jones, the one constant through all the years has been baseball. And I think that'll go on forever and ever. I think and I am biased, obviously. I love the game. I think it's the greatest game there is. I think one of the biggest components of its popularity in the 1900s to 1950s, it's the perfect radio game. I think the development of television, the fast-paced media, that kills baseball, because I still enjoy listening to baseball on the radio, which kids don't do. I think when you add in that it's a long season, there's 162 games of baseball, people come in and out of baseball, and it's easier to do that than football, where you only have 15 weeks to play or 16 weeks and pay attention once a week. I think with baseball fans, you're asking fans, we want your attention for 6 months throughout the year, every day. In today's world of Twitter, social media, they just want once a week to pay attention to the TV and then turn it off. Well, baseball's not that type of game, and I hope it never becomes that type of game. It's slow, it's methodical, there's something different about it, but I think it'll always last because of that.
And it's the best game to watch in person, too, on the radio. I mean, to go to a football game at Penn State, I like to go, but I have to sit next to Ron. There's like 18 inches of seat room, and we're not built for 36 inches together. And, it's loud. And go to a baseball game, it's a beautiful afternoon. And
Please come.
And it's wonderful, but it doesn't translate well to television, and that is a major part of the relative decline in market share that basketball and football really translated to a new technology that developed at the time that baseball started to decline. There's a direct correlation.
And you're right, Red Barber and Scully, they were personalities.
And wasn't Red Barber the one that was on here?
Yeah.
He's a Southerner.
Southern, sure.
You notice
Yeah.
his accent?
One of the omissions in the movie is
It was
Red
New
Barber's
England.
from Tallahassee, Florida, and he almost resigned when the Dodgers brought up Robinson, and so. And he later says that Robinson changed his life, that he's the person that really had his attitudes about race change. But I mean, that's an omission, I guess. But it would have been powerful in the movie, just a little scene with this famous announcer almost quitting, and known as a very genteel and civilized guy, not a Ray Chapman type, but to show racism in all its forms. And Barber later spoke tremendously of how Jackie Robinson impacted and altered his life for the good by altering his racial views. He grew up in segregated Tallahassee.
Which really gets at your question earlier, just about the cultural mores, social mores that people had to struggle with. And, whether they're pig-headed and just limited in their focus, that was their life.
It was.
So this introduction of something new, and they didn't understand it, they were ignorant.
I wanted to say a couple, let you go first.
No, he can ask it at home. Unless it's to one of these guys. Don't ask me any.
Like Ichiro from Japan, how come wasn't like then there wasn't any Japanese players, or were there? Did they try to integrate them in the majors?
Well, that's an interesting question, because the Japanese were introduced to baseball really by the Negro Leagues, or the legend is by Babe Ruth, but
Right.
so that goes back some years, way before all of our time here, I think.
Excellent question.
But yeah, it's an interesting. I guess I don't know the Japanese history that much after.
There's
Just knowing a little about where they start. But
Yeah, there's a Japanese American player before World War II that bounced, and I don't remember the name, so don't ask me, but bounced around a little bit.
There was
But really, it's the and there are Japanese leagues, especially in California. there's their own forms of segregation. They sometimes play Negro League teams.
Yes.
They play white teams as well. I mean, there's
For the
a
major
whole
leagues, that's a good
history.
question, it's interesting. Well,
Yeah, and
it was
I
probably
wonder-
just too
70s
exotic,
and
whatever, I don't
80s.
know.
Yeah.
Because of World War II.
Yeah, so.
Of course, one thing is, after they're introduced to baseball, that's another chunk of the bigger history. You have, roughly in that period, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the what's the word I need? People from the Orient kind of say, I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act tells you, we don't want Chinese here. They built the railroad for us, the Transcontinental Railroad. We don't want them anymore. They face terrible discrimination and racism. So maybe that's part of it. I don't know. They got a bad taste of this country. Many who came, and of course, our treatment of the Japanese in World War II is abominable in the concentration camps, work camps, or whatever they call them. I had a word for it. But we stole their property. Many of one generation was incarcerated, you might say. Their kids were all fighting Hitler, or fighting the Japanese. So, I don't know the particulars of the baseball.
Yeah, there's a thriving commerce between Japan and the U.S. pre-World War II in baseball, and teams that travel back and forth in different generations, and it gets interrupted by World War II. But when the U.S. occupies Japan after the war, one of the first things it does is restore the professional leagues in Japan, which had dated to the 1920s.
But they never decided that they wanted to bring a player like Robinson.
Not to my knowledge. You'd have to ask Sam Regalado when you see him next, or some people that work on that side, but not that early. That's more a 1960s, 70s, 80s show.
But that'd be for
Go ahead.
baseball during the time the Negro Leagues were back during the 50s and 40s, 30s. You could go into baseball young and you got old. Now you go into baseball young and you come out young. And that's another draw in terms of why it's dying. Football, same thing. It's, the lifespan in baseball today is what, 3 years?
3.5 years.
3.5 years.
Less than the
And
pension.
The biggest
Football.
reason is that it's a game of failure. It's a hard game. It's
Attrition.
It's a harder game than basketball and football. You're considered successful if you hit 300. If you get hit 30% of the time, you're really good, and that's hard to deal with. It's hard to tell a young man you're going to fail 70% of the time and you're still one of the greatest kids around, because, and this is my generation and younger, we are soft. We are mentally weak, and we think, well, if I'm going to fail at it, I'm just going to give up and go do something else. It's a tough game, and I think that's part of the reason that kids don't play it as much. They want quick success. They want to be told they're the greatest. They want to be told that, hey, good job because you did well today.
It's also a broad skill set.
Yes, there's a lot of different things involved.
However, they're 70% successful on defense.
Yeah.
You don't think that?
I mean,
Very true.
not
That's a
the
sore subject for them after last weekend.
one of not the inaccuracies in the
That was
movies, but
brutal.
the left out things is that Jackie Robinson had a terrible first spring training. There were real questions about whether he could even play for Montreal at the AAA level. He could not hit anything. He was in a huge slump. He writes about it himself. And imagine the pressure on this guy. There are arguments that hitting a major league fastball is the most difficult thing anybody can do. And he's writing about that. If he's trying to make a team, which is hard, you fail a lot, and he feels that he has the burden of his entire race on his shoulders. If he fails, no other African American will ever get a chance. Whether that was true or not, that's how he felt. And so, in that sense, when they're portraying him as really successful that first spring training, he really struggled. Ricky stuck with him and knew his talent, but
Claude
he
Steele talked
did
about
not
that
do
today.
well.
Claude Steele, he referenced Jackie Robinson as that being a stereotype threat. Where a person taking tests today who are women, minorities, and they're stacked up against males or white males who are taking tests against Asians, and you tell them who they're competing with, your grade goes right down. It's amazing.
Adobe's opening season was kind of that way too. Yeah, it was debatable. And of course, in both cases, they're pushed to play different positions, which wasn't not unusual in the Negro Leagues. Jackie played, I believe, everything but pitching and catching. He played every position, predominantly with first base, second base,
Shortstop.
left field, shortstop, of course. Yeah, but I mean, Adobe was the same thing. You give him a glove and say, what's his name, Vec.
Bill
Bill
Vec says, read a book on being an outfielder. He literally, so worked this summer, that I think to most athletes, they're especially they're specialized in career track, but they had to jump around.
It's not baseball, but we're getting ready to see other barriers come down with, Jason Collins recently got a contract in the NBA, and Michael Sam is likely to be drafted by the NFL. What would the leaders of those teams learn from Branch Rickey and Jackie Robinson as they go through this process and work on this particular barrier?
But one aspect I see, particularly some of the sports writers, I see them throw around is the locker room culture. I mean, addressing that, now that's clearly in the gay athlete issue but it's the same in a lot of ways. It's like, you got to make it clear in the locker room that it's got to start there, and there's got to be this culture with incognito kind of stuff, bullying. That's got to go anyway, but particularly in the gay hetero kind of context, that's an important factor. So somebody that can set the tone, and I don't think that was over exaggerated in the film. Ricky sets the tone. DeRoche or whoever down the line, they got to toe the line, and that's a big difference, say, even from Vec and his manager Boudreau, who's not really on pro. He doesn't know exactly what to do. He's a young guy himself, and he's managing, and he hasn't been through the scenarios and the role plays like I'm sure Ricky put, his hierarchy. So that to me is something that there's a similarity there. So I would think an NFL team that would take Sam, they're going to succeed best if they can plan ahead and face that. Of course, today it's so different with the media and all, and talking. That's one of the ways out. They say, well, this would be a circus, but you heard that in the film.
I think you're really talking about the inclusion culture to do what's right. We had a basketball player here, John Amici, and when he came out and talked about what it was like in the NBA, and that took a lot of courage, but it was very easy for him. It was very simple because those were his values. That's what you're seeing now. Society has to get used to it, but the athletes themselves and the culture in the locker room, it's pretty much not an issue to them. So you're right, it's current events.
I mean, I would be shocked if the Richie Incognitos of the world didn't launch a petition against gay player. It's going to happen again. It's going to be the same thing. I mean, I think
the bounty schemes.
The locker room shower issue to me is simple. The NFL has so much money, everybody can have their own shower. They can all have their own showers, right? And they can all have their own rooms on the road. It's not an issue. What you need, though, is Pee Wee Reese to come over and put their arm around somebody in a public situation. And are you going to get that? Well, you did in baseball, and it was difficult. And hopefully you will in other sports.
With Sam already, you have it in the sense
in college he got that.
He tells his team what in the ending of the season, what's coming up and where he's going, and they keep it secret. That even more remarkable to me that nobody tweets out of this whole thing. I mean, that was pretty disciplined, pretty unified camaraderie to do that. I think that's cool.
Because it wasn't an issue to them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
If you can produce and you're confident, then that's really what inclusion is supposed to be about. It wasn't an issue.
Was it accurate about that ref who called him out when he was clearly saying?
I don't remember about that particular.
I'm sure it happened. I'm
Probably
positive.
not in the
First
first
at bat.
game. The first player.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little Hollywood license, but I mean, Robinson was scrutinized at every step of the way. He did lead the league in getting hit by pitches. On the other hand, he was a player that crowded the plate and leaned in and was aggressive.
Yes.
So, but I'm sure there were some calls that didn't go his way, and part of it had to do with race at times. But yeah, I don't recall.
There's some poetic license in some of the stuff. But although some of the detail, like the spiking, we know that Jackie developed a way to get off that base fast so he wouldn't be spiked because he knew he was going to be intentionally spiked in addition to regular spiking. So there's good detail and maybe loose detail or poetic detail.
And while there's no defense of Ray Chapman, he was horrible to everybody. I mean, the Phillies manager said things to everybody all the time. And so, yeah, he singled out Robinson, and it was racial. But, like he's talking about Hank Greenberg, what they call him, and DiMaggio. And that standard, Ray Chapman, that's standard Phillies behavior.
And I wanted to
They were
mention,
awful.
Yeah, Phillies fans still, they relish that kind of reputation. They used to, I don't know, maybe after they got out of the old vet, maybe they stopped doing that. There's that idea, we're obnoxious to everybody, we're equal opportunity obnoxious, discriminatory, whatever, so.
He only
They
lasted
Santa
2 years from
Claus.
1947 to 1949 he was fired.
What's that?
He lasted from 1947 to 1949 he was fired.
I don't know how long he had been there, but he gets
I
fired
just see
after
him-
the 48 season, yeah.
Yeah.
He wasn't much of a manager, the Phillies didn't have much of a team. Some things don't change. Oops.
I was a slight.
All right, it's about 9:23. Do we have any more questions for our panel?
How did Jackie Robinson, in the beginning of the movie, they make it seem like he's pretty self-contained, it's for himself, he didn't really like help. How did he mature? Did he become a powerful spokesman beyond baseball? I mean, that would still be his platform, but how did he change?
Well, he goes to, when he leaves after 9-10 years, he goes to work, because he's going to be traded, he goes to work for Chock-full of Nuts. He's really I think he is the first, maybe Herb Douglas down in Philly is the second, the first African-American corporate executive. But he's always been dabbling in politics, starting and after that point. And his politics tend to line up with Rockefeller, with
Nixon.
Richard Nixon. And part of the Nixon story is he met Jack Kennedy and he wouldn't look him in the eyes. So he took that to mean something. That's at least part of the
And he,
apocryphal or not.
he also,
No,
he attacks Robeson at one point on
yeah,
House
the House
on
Un-American
Activities.
Activities.
So his
Committee,
politics are, I would say, like more from the gut. I don't know that they're, and from my view, they're not as thought out as they would be. He later apologized at the end of his life. He says he really regrets what position he got put in to put Robeson in, which of course was typical. But he certainly speaks out. He gets involved in causes, some politics, and so forth.
He's a backer of Martin Luther King,
Martin
the
Luther
Civil
King, yes,
Rights
absolutely,
Movement.
yeah.
But let's put it in context. Remember, for all our retrospect on Richard Nixon in the 1960s was a pro-civil rights politician. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, and the shift from Republican to Democrat, it goes from Franklin Roosevelt through about the 1970s, but there are a lot of African Americans who still supported and saw Nixon as much more liberal on racial issues
They're
than
bothered
white
with the
Southern
Dixiecrats.
Democrats.
Bothered with the Dixiecrats,
Yeah,
that's right.
and
It's
Nixon is the inventor of busing for desegregation.
And
so
equally,
in
you
a
could say that
different
about
era.
Rockefeller. Like in
Yeah.
labor rights, Rockefeller
Right.
opens up healthcare organizing in the state of New York. Not that he really wants to, but he has to, and so he makes deals, and it is a very complex.
And he was Robinson was a backer of Hubert Humphrey. But yeah, he did not consider Kennedy sincere on
Yeah.
civil rights, and
Yeah.
he was not. So he backed Nixon in 1960, as did a lot of African Americans, not just Jackie Robinson. I would say, so Dave doesn't know the whole story, but I think the stress did shorten his life. Now certainly, but he's a guy, his brothers lived much longer than he did. And his widow would testify to this day that, he internalized a lot of it. And he was much more a hothead than he's portrayed at in the movie. This was not a turn the other cheek guy. He was a type A personality.
He was.
And he had to swallow a lot and deal with a lot. And he dies, he's 53 years old. And I think it shortened his life. I think he sacrificed a huge portion of his life.
Well, and you see that for any of the guys. That's why when I asked the Negro League guys, because they did, many of them were up front said, I just couldn't take it. I know what I would have done, and if I hadn't, it would have killed me the other way. Elston Howard's wife ends her book about her husband dealing with the Yankees. Says, I think it's the last sentence, baseball killed my husband. Now, whether she's clinically correct, and there aren't other factors I wouldn't dispute, but that's what she meant, that what he had to go through, and Ellie was, and that was a little bit later, although it was, again, as you said, in a franchise that held out to the end, or almost near the end.
Yeah. And
My comment was really about diabetes and things.
Sure.
like that.
Yeah, and certainly he
And
had
hypertension.
hypertension.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, there is,
And there's
people are
some
doing a
reasons.
lot of research now that there definitely is a severe physiological impact from dealing with racism, and they are starting to see some connections. I'm not sure how strong it is, but it's something people are looking at, and there's definitely, when you have to deal with things over and over and over again.
Can't sleep.
Yeah.
And one thing I'd say about Robinson, he stayed true to the end. He charged and fought, He fought with baseball. He remained angry, you know, that the Dodgers didn't have black managers, they didn't have black front office personnel, they didn't offer him a job like they offered a lot of white players when they retired. He did not like, for instance, not like is too strong a word, but he had battles with Campanella and Willie
Yep.
Mays and other players who
Yep.
just want to say, this is good enough to let us
Yep.
play, just be happy, just smile. And why do you want to keep pushing and agitating, Jackie? Because he was a pusher and an agitator. And that's to Branch Rickey's credit. He knew that too. He picked a guy that agitated for the rest of his life and pushed baseball and American society to do better. He was
And
resilient.
when you see and hear the footage of his last public appearance in baseball, Crosley Field, I think Cincinnati, and he's there and he's virtually blind, and he doesn't look 50 something. He said he's being adulated, and you know, it's kind of like Gary going out or whoever, but he says, they ask him and he says, I'm happy to be here, something of that sort, but I'll be happy when I can look down the third base line and see an African American coach. Or, you know, he's uses that opportunity to make a little sermon, you might say, and put it right out there in front of people who are waiting. And say, I'm happy, I'm old, and I'm not that old, I look bad, but you know, it's all okay. No, he didn't say that.
Did
He's
he and
interested
Jesse
in
Owens
hiring.
develop any kind of intimacy? He and Jesse Owens? I think there wasn't.
They're both backers of Nixon. Owens too
Yeah.
is an older generation, you know, stays with the Republican Party. They know one another. To my knowledge, they're not good friends or anything, but they would, you know, make appearances and get invited to similar gatherings and things like that.
That 1960 Olympic Games, where you had Carlos and the rest of them. for fifth.
68, yep.
That was Jackie was involved in that. He was basically rejected.
Well, Jesse is sent in to kind of calm down the team, and you know, it's sad
Yeah.
because you know Jesse has been racing horses. Jesse's nowhere. Mac Robinson is working janitorial work. He can't get anywhere. He was in that Olympics with Jesse. You know, that all those ironies and tragedies, you might say, wrapped up. And there's two kinds of positions, but
By the way, Mac Robinson's Jackie Robinson's older brother.
That's what I
I mean,
was
there's
gonna
two
say.
different narratives here.
Right.
The story we forget is the more typical is the Mac Robinson story.
Sure.
A guy who wins a silver medal and gets a degree in physical education from Oregon. And the only job he can get is as a custodian in the LA County schools. And later becomes an activist and a very interesting guy. But that's what happened. There's not that many Jackie Robinsons who get adulation and white America loves them. There's a lot more Mac Robinsons who almost changed attitudes but live very difficult lives after their
Barney
athletics.
And a
Ewell.
Blake one.
Barney Ewell
Yeah, at Penn
at
State.
Penn State.
Yeah.
Couldn't get a job
Ended up as janitor.
in Lancaster, York.
I know the story well.
Any more questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.